Very good morning to you all who have joined this flagship webinar on general network access. I welcome you all to this webinar. We are honored with the presence of Mr. P.K. Pujari, Chairman CERC and former Secretary, Ministry of Power. We are highly grateful to you, sir, for accepting our invitation to the chief guest and deliver inaugural address. We are also grateful to other speakers present. Mr. Ghanshyam Prasad, Joint Secretary, Ministry of Power. Mr. Shri, Mr. Nasman was to join, but due to some engagement, his Director Marketing, Mr. Barpanda, has joined. Mr. Sawant has joined. Mr. Banga, who is convener of this group, was also a member of the discussion group, and he had some pressing engagement. So Mr. Devanand from his part has joined. I thank you all for accepting our invitation to join and share your views on this most advanced and relevant subject. Just few words. India has, as on March 1, 2022, total generating capacity of 395,000 megawatt and transmission network of 456,000 circuit kilometers through 223 kV AC, 400 kV AC, 765 AC, 320 kV, 500 kV, 800 kV DC system. The transportation of power from generating point to source of demand is very important. And we will today get enriched from all the distinguished speakers, the policies and programs to further this system. India's electricity transmission sector is gearing up to face these challenges posed by a changing power demand and energy mix. Particularly the energy mix is very important because renewal is playing a very major role. In order to meet future peak load, which is expected to reach 267 gigawatt by 2025, huge investments are required to strengthen and ramp up this to the country's transmission system. I will now say a few words about India Energy Forum. India Energy Forum is a non-profit NGO, was set up in February 2001 and celebrated its 20th anniversary in June 2021. As Mr. Shahi has always been insisting, it is a think tank of highly experienced members in all verticals of energy. Its mission is to evolve a national energy policy aimed at developing of a sustainable and competitive energy sector in India. It is probably the only organization which champions the cause of total energy. All forms of energy ranging from coal, power, thermal, hydro, oil and gas, nuclear and renewables from the beginning of and helped to take an integrated look at the energy sector. India Energy Forum was holding physical meets on each of this vertical every year before, but due to COVID restrictions, from September 2020, India Energy Forum decided to start holding these webinars on each vertical, and I am pleased to share this is our 28th webinar. All our webinars have been well attended and addressed by highly experienced and known experts in their field. With the initiative of our President, Mr. R. Shahi, in the last 6-7 webinars, we had the fortune of inviting the Secretary of the concerned ministry and were honored with their presence. Today, we are honored with the presence of Mr. Pujari, Chairman CERC and former Secretary, Ministry of Power. India Energy Forum is publishing its flagship publication, Total Energy, which is a bi-monthly publication. This publication covers news items on all verticals of energy, articles and proceedings of the webinars to over 500 individuals and organizations, including the executives and all secretaries and joint secretaries and all other officers of the ministries concerned. I once again welcome you all, and I am confident that you will find the proceedings of this webinar interesting, and you will go back adding to your knowledge on this subject. That's all for the, in fact, I also said that the new team under the leadership of Mr. Shahi, we have taken over in August 2020. Let us hope that we are hoping that things will improve and permit us to hold the physical seminars, summits on each subject. With these words, again, welcoming Mr. Pujari, I thank you all for joining. And now we'll request Mr. Sadhana to please give his views on present theme and introduce the speakers.
Okay. So good morning, everyone. It's my equal pleasure to welcome our chief guest, Mr. P.K. Pujari, Chairman CERC and former Secretary to Government of India. Also, warm welcome to several ex-secretaries to the Government of India, several senior regulators, senior members from the fraternity, and various panelists of today's event. This subject, as we were discussing a few minutes before in our informal gathering, is a very progressive and a very apt subject in the current times, especially the kind of role the grid will now play with several formats of generation joining in, and more so in the days ahead, with more emphasis on renewables as well as storage. It will play a very significant role. So it's coming at the right time. Started in 2013. It has taken quite some time in terms of deliberation. But as the name suggests, and I will use a brief presentation to do the context setting. Thank you. So as I said, it's taken quite some time in terms of how the general network access as a concept is now going to become a reality. And the interesting part is, as the name suggests, in the earlier times, we were doing a top-down approach in terms of building our grid network. So we will have a generator who would raise kind of mention that fact that they are going to come into the grid system. And accordingly, they will have a beneficiary, or there'll be a target set of locations where they want to sell their electrons. And accordingly, the whole transmission system would get designed to cater to such a requirement. And of course, there were regional players who will endorse that. There was a perspective that gradually evolved into a national grid system, but it was all top-down approach. In the general network access, as the name suggests, and simplifying that for the benefit of all, it provides access to ultimately the consumer. And therefore, the consumptive part becomes important. In the entire basis of GNA is the fact that every customer, therefore, can look forward to having access and choice in terms of getting their electrons, not necessarily from a chosen point, but swap that, change that with ease. And therefore, it requires tremendous amount of planning and tremendous amount of strengthening of the grid system. And over a period of time, it's for that reason that this subject has been receiving tremendous amount of deliberations, debates, but eventually, as we see today and as we are discussing, we have the latest December 2021 draft CERC regulations. And of course, prior to that, we also had from the Government of India the approach paper and details with regard to the guidelines. Now, I'll quickly go through what exactly is this about so that the context gets set, and then we'll have the experts deliberate that, and we'll have the inaugural address by the chairperson of the CERC. On the connectivity concepts, as they will exist, the quantum is being made further lower. And the interesting part is that that this is for ISTS system. Now, as we all understand, Indian system of electricity is a concurrent subject. It is dealt at the state level, it is dealt at the national level. So we have the interstate transmission system, and then we have the intrastate transmission system, which is normally looked after by the state. But right now, what we are talking about, these guidelines pertain primarily to the interstate transmission system, which we by acronym call that as ISTS system. And therefore, it provides tremendous amount of flexibility to such of the customers which wish to come on the ISTS system. And that's, friends, what is specified as the minimum quantum of connectivity as 50 megawatt. And then, of course, the various generators and various formats of those who provide electrons, they will have the flexibility of coming on to the ISTS system. There is a provision for automatic movement of those who are already connected under the GNA system, and those who are going to be new, there is a clear system of how they will apply and how they will get the connectivity. I'm not going to get into details. There are two types of connectivity that is envisioned in this. One is the general network access, which normally will be looked after by CTU. And as we all know, the CTU is an independent body which has been in the works. And of course, for temporary GNA, wherever it is needed, there'll be NLDC which will be permitted to decide on those matters and get the connectivity. There are enshrined principles in terms of the fact that if there is no associated augmentation of transmission system needed, then the approval system is quicker. And in the event that there is a associated transmission system that needs to be augmented, then there is a cost paradigm that's going to be indicated by the CTU, and basis which the entire system moves on. So very proper systems have been provided, though of course one would presume that one will be able to get more details in terms of some of the fee structure, etc., which has been provided and looks a bit expensive, but those are comments on the draft that various stakeholders have provided, and I'm sure CERC would look at those options, and we will get to hear that from the chairperson. In terms of draft regulation, there are procedures provided for general network access. The eligibility criteria, as I stated in which you will see in the first top box, is provided here, where until now, no DISCOM could have access to the ISTS system directly. It had to necessarily go through the STU system. One would see as to how distribution licensee now could have access. They certainly can still continue having the access to ISTS through the STU. But there is also a provision that it could change now, because DISCOM still now were not entitled to seek direct connectivity from ISTS. Bulk customers were entitled. As we all know, above 100 megawatt could ask for CTU connection. There are several examples which exist today. But this is a big change that's going to happen in the times to come. There are provisions on the how trading licensee could also seek this, but there are some provisions which need to be augmented, and those are part of the stakeholder comments that I'm sure have gone to the CERC in terms of the cross-border trade. And of course, the rest is more in terms of the current ways of doing things and how the current methods will translate or transgress automatically to the GNA systems. Now, there are also concepts in terms of how deemed grant will happen based on the existing part. Those provisions have been very well laid out. And the additional GNA, if it is to be sought, what are the provisions that one could have? Those provisions have also been specified. There are a few aspects which need a bit more clarity, because for generators, which is shifting, it's been indicated as installed capacity. One would want to understand, should it be installed capacity minus auxiliary power consumption? And what kind of norms would follow with regard to those aspects also. In terms of a very key subject, which is relinquishment, this has been a subject of debate. There have been committees created by the initiatives of CERC, which has given their report in the past. And now it's being simplified to 5 years of the transmission charges. So that's the way that's been provided. But I guess, again, in terms of the various orders of various forums, this is a subject matter that would need a bit more discussion, because if the system does not lose anything, what is the way the relinquishment can actually support movement, unless it is malicious in nature. As I said, there are provisions provided for temporary GNA, and those are in terms of details, and I am not going to get into context setting for that part, because those are very specific to such users, which is not in routine course of business. But in terms of discipline, very well provided in the draft guidelines. This is my last slide in terms of context setting. On the left-hand side, I'm putting some of the very key positives. Besides being very progressive, very apt, very timely, I would say that this is going to give tremendous amount of boost in terms of the general flexibility and access to the buying entity. So very proactive from customers' perspective. Also, very clearly in terms of charges to be borne by the buyers, and therefore generators don't pay any charges in terms of transmission usage. And again, therefore puts, as they say, money where the mouth is, and very, very appropriate in terms of how it's been provided. Again, grant of connectivity is independent of contract or PPA, gives flexibility to generators to avail GNA even if untied. So till date, as I said, we would typically go by what the generator indicates in terms of PPA or issues, and then to apply for long-term open access if they are merchant. Was quite a challenge in terms of now it's very simplified. Swapping of GNA quantum between buying entities allows efficient use of generation sources. As I said, provides a lot of flexibility. So our buyer could have choice of sourcing of electrons. So that's another big advantage. The other point I have already talked, generator flexibility to be connected to both ISTS as well as intrastate system without, of course, overlapping capacities. So you could actually choose of splitting your capacities and seeking those advantages. So it's going to provide a big boost for merchant capacities, especially for renewables, which has not seen merchant capacities. In fact, whole country has still just about less than 100 megawatt of renewable untied capacity. So this is going to be a big boost now in terms of the flexibility that they will have. More flexibility for choice of injection and drawal, less constraints and improved gestation period of projects. This is going to be, again, one of the big plus points. Though, of course, I must add that the country as a whole will need tremendous amount of dollars to augment the system to provide this flexibility to the buyer to have the access. free access. Better transmission planning, but very, very robust transmission planning that's needed for GNA, and development of exchange market, of course, which will give flexibility. Because today, as we know, over a period of time, the capacities have evolved for freedom for exchange to use that flexible capacity. The flexible capacity is one point of time used to be just 15%, then became 25%. But in many corridors, we are aware that it's not that easy for exchange of power. Now with GNA, again, since the customer is going to have the choice, that will presumably add more flexibility for the customer, and therefore exchange system will also be a big benefactor in this entire system. A bit pauses in terms of what one would hope over a period of time will get clarified. Needs a bit more clarity in terms of which agency would be responsible to eliminating overall transmission constraints and be answerable, and how would those timelines be determined. Besides CERC, which takes care of the ISTS system, the access will eventually also have to ultimately give the right message, need to strengthen the state systems as well. And we have talked about the subject for many, many years, and as to how do we really prop up that system is one aspect that we will have to deliberate in times to come. One would hope to get a bit more clarity in terms of treatment or compensation to affected party in terms of mismatch. And especially this is happening more in the RE capacities, and it's a constant discussion that our CERC itself has been promoting between the generators and the transcos and the transmission TBCB developers as to how do we make this more palatable and more disciplined. And there are no easy answers, but I must commend CERC for having put this to several amount of deliberations with tremendous amount of open mind in terms of how do we make it more fair to both sides. Very high connectivity BG requirements have been specified. One would only hope that over a period of time, once a discipline sets in, it will be moderated, it will be kind of reduced. Then the clarity perhaps could be lended on the cross-border transactions, because those need a bit more scenario planning in terms of the fact that what kind of scenarios exist for cross-border transaction, and therefore what kind of approval mechanisms, both in terms of timeline and agencies involved, will be useful to get that. Because we, as I see personally, and we have been engaged with several amount of cross borders now opening up, and more so will happen particularly with our neighbors, and with the one sun, one world, one grid, you would perhaps see advent of that being expedited. And in the end, I would say there is a need for end-to-end implementation methodology, and one would also hope that the sharing regulations and the IGC, the grid code, will need to be amended simultaneously, because there are lots of dissonance that will set in if the two were not to be modified at the same time. So those are more operational parts, but important and is required. And I'm sure we will get to hear that from the experts, including our guest of honor. So I will stop here. This is what I wanted to do in terms of context setting, so that we can get the experts to deliberate some of these points. So once again, thank you for joining this session, and I welcome all delegates, including our panelists as well as our chief guest. Thank you once again.
Thank you, Mr. Sadana, for very nicely laying the ground for the discussions today, clearly defining the topics. Transmission will acquire a very dominant place. As you rightly says, interstate transmission system has to be strengthened. And I think we are on the right path. Power Grid's role has been very, very encouraging and very respectful. May I now request our President, Mr. R.V. Shahi, to please give his presidential address.
Thank you, Mr. Bambani. I think we had a very nice presentation by Mr. Anil Sardana, let me congratulate him as chairman of the Transmission and Distribution Vertical of India Energy Forum for organizing this. And also I must express my particular thanks to Mr. Pujari, because Mr. Pujari was in double mind because he is coming to us again in the month of May on a very important topic of role of regulators in decarbonizing the power sector. And therefore he thought that would it be okay if we have this program as well, and I requested, and he did oblige. He said, yes, we will do both. We will do this program as well as the program which is going to happen in the month of middle of May or so. So thank you, Mr. Pujari, to accept our invitation to be the chief guest for this important subject. And I think many of the initial things, the preliminaries, the introduction about the subject, and also the great features of this particular document, and also the limitations, some of the limitations which Mr. Anil Sardana has brought about. Because as you all know, access to transmission has always been an interesting debate because there are different stakeholders and they will have different perspectives. Transmission company will look at it from their point of view, how they de-risk their own investment. Generation company will look at it from their point of view, that what happens when the PPA is in trouble or the drawal doesn't take place, or like if the transmission constraint is there. So there would be obviously different perspectives. Each will try to see any document, any draft in the manner that they think it is least risky for them. But one has to definitely take a balanced view. Electricity Act does provide a non-discriminatory open access to transmission. That is a fundamental. In section 38 and section 39, 38 relating to the central sector and 39 relating to the state sector. And it has given a role to the different entities. In this act, we did provide for what existed, what would be the transition, and what would be the futuristic vision. And therefore, no chaotic condition was created. In the beginning, Power Grid Corporation was everything. And then we had to bring out the system operator, you have POSOCO today. Then we had to bring out central transmission utility. All these are envisaged to ensure that when multiple players are in the market, the private sector, joint venture sector, public sector, government departments, how do we ensure that the whole issue is dealt with in a balanced manner? In good old days, state electricity boards were everything. I mean, all the entities that you are seeing today, to ensure transparency, to ensure objectivity, to ensure that there is no conflict of interest. Everything was conflict of interest, but everything was together. So we unbundled the electricity board of the Supply Act. And then later on in transmission, the last word was Power Grid Corporation in the center. So it will have RLDC with them, it will have NLDC with them, it will have everything with them. So gradually we evolved into different entities to ensure, and on the top of it, regulators to ensure mechanism, to formulate mechanism, to see that there is a fair play. And at the same time, also handle many challenging situations. Some of the challenging situations Mr. Anil Sardana just now brought about. As I said, that where do we go? When we had the first super thermal power station in the central sector, as I said, SCB was everything. Then the issue was who will do the transmission. So the first super thermal power station, the transmission was done by UP State Electricity Board. And then this Cabinet Committee on Economic Affairs and the PIB insisted, no, generation project PIB note should come along with evacuation system. So subsequently, transmission was given to the generating company. So generation investment and transmission investment to ensure that what is generated is supplied to the states, to the beneficiaries. That was the thing at that time. It was felt that is the best way of handling it. That then question of transmission did not come, generation mismatch, etc., would not arise. But from there we have evolved because we didn't see that only one NTPC would be good enough to take care of the power supply situation of the country. So when we have a large number of players, how do we handle this? So later on, transmission was taken out, another company was created. And from that company, we have created so many institutions now. Very recently, I mean, recently, not in terms of months, but in terms of few years, we have strengthened the POSOCO, we have done the central transmission utility. Even now, people have doubts whether it is really an independent entity separately or not. Because government is authorized to declare CTU, to declare national load dispatch centers, state load dispatch centers. This document itself has been under debate for a number of years. When Mr. Scindia was the minister, at that time he had created an advisory group. I was also there in the advisory group, and I had occasion to discuss in detail in 4-5 meetings the draft that had been prepared by the Central City Authority sometime in 2013. And then there itself I could see different groups pulling in different directions, and the challenge was to create a consensus and to create which more objective and transparent, and something emerged. And since then, as Anil Sardana brought out in his initial chart, that historically it has taken about 9-10 years to come to some level. I think this draft finally is a very balanced draft. It doesn't entail a large amount of burden, financial burden to the generating company for booking the transmission capacity. It only says that you will have to perform what you are saying. If you did not perform, then your bank guarantee is in trouble. That to a limited amount. But one point Mr. Sardana brought out just now, apart from a few other points, that if somebody relinquishes because of some uncontrollable reasons, is the penalty commensurate with the situation, particularly when the transmission capacity does not remain underutilized or unused. So that is an issue. Some of the other points that also he has brought out about clarity needs to be brought about on certain things like the procedure for approval. And a word on that, I think a word of caution on that. There is no problem. We have high respect for the Central City Authority. And I remember in cross-border transmission system, designated authority is the Central City Authority. But it does take time. It does take time. And sometimes, even though they are designated authority, I'm told they have to consult the ministry to handle the situation. So those are the final points which may not totally align with the objective. The intention may not be that, but then somehow in implementation it gets into some sort of a derailment. As a result, see, we can do the best of things, but those who are users, they have also to say that yes, in a balanced way, that is okay. So on this designated authority, there are some feelings among the South Asian countries that it is a little too heavy burden on the designated authority's way of doing things. So I think it is taking time. So I think that concern that has been brought out, flagged by Anil Sardana, looks to be a reasonable one. How do we handle this? Not easy. Designated authority. So I mentioned to the designated authority, who is a member power system, that you are the designated authority, the blame goes to you. And I will not name who I was mentioning. He said, what do? We have to consult the ministry. And what is the fun in making designated authority when we have to consult on everything? So those are the issues. So the implementational gaps that happen at the document stage, we can always say document spirit and letter is not in that manner. But how do we, but at the same time, we should be cognizant of. Are we formulating it in a manner that it lends itself to this type of a problem? So those are some of the issues. But on the balance, I just glanced through. This document is a very good document. When we were doing the Electricity Act and finally with so many amendments, we went to the cabinet. Again, it is not a secret, and I will not divulge that part of the secret. I mean, one of the ministers said a point, and then we gave the clarification. Another minister says, which act is perfect? Even the existing act. Importance is they should move forward. When we implement, we find difficulty, we can definitely make changes. So I think which document can ever be perfect? And in any case, situation is so dynamic. Today's market structure demands certain type of dispensation. Tomorrow's market structure might be different. And in that market structure, certain other type of dispensation will be necessary. What is important is that we move forward, because it has taken almost 8-9 years to come to this level of regulatory commission being in a position to come out with a final set of document. And therefore, let us move and correct whenever we find difficulty. With these words, I once again congratulate this vertical, this Mr. Sardana's vertical in the India Energy Forum, for organizing and choosing this subject. And once again, profusely thank Mr. Pujari to participate and give the inaugural address. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Shahi, for adding up the whole background as to how the birth of the power grid was made and how the transmission system started shifting from the generating company to the independent companies. And not only we have restricted ourselves to India, we are also having very good participation and dialogue with the nearby countries. Recently, POSCO organized a workshop for training of people from Bhutan, Sri Lanka, Nepal, all other neighboring countries. So we are proud that we have made all our contribution to growth of transmission system in India. Particularly, interstate has been very, very promising, and DC system introduced also to transport the power. With these words, may I now request our chief guest, Shri P.K. Pujari, Chairperson CERC, to please give his inaugural address. Mr. Pujari, please.
Thank you, and good morning to all of you. Mr. Shahi, Mr. Anil Sardana, Mr. Bhamrani, and Mr. Banga, of course, is not there, and all the distinguished panelists and the guests. At the outset, I would like to congratulate IEF for organizing this webinar on the GNA, which in my view is one of the most far-reaching reforms that is being undertaken now. It will, as and when it put in place, it will transform how the planner, the policymakers, and the regulators will address the issue of connectivity and access, and how the planning of ISTS would be done in future. As was pointed out by Mr. Shahi, the issue on GNA has been under debate and discussion for a long time, last 10 years. There was a paper of CEA, and in fact, CERC also had taken out a draft regulation and did conduct the public hearing, I think about 3 years back, 3.5 years back. But a lot of issues were there which needed to be relooked, and a huge transformation in the Indian power sector was going on. And considering those issues like penetration of renewable and then other issues, technology, CERC thought that it is better to have a de novo fresh look at the concept and come out with a fresh draft regulations instead of going ahead with the one that had been drafted and notified earlier. So this took time. Also, I like to highlight that the point that was made by Mr. Sardana, in all the regulations, the key document or the key regulation is the grid code. It is from the grid code that many of the regulations do flow. But look at the way the Commission has done some of the major, notified the major regulations. We came out with the power market regulations. We came out with the ancillary services regulations. We came out with the DSM regulations. They have all been finalized. GNA and the sharing regulation also have been finalized. All these regulations have their elements flowing out of grid code. The ideal thing would have been to have the grid code first and then have these regulations subsequently. We did try that, But then the commission felt that in a grid code, when you look at holistically all the small components, the interplay and the key or the very, very salient feature of each individual regulations get missed out. So we thought that let's do and address the components first. So these are the various components, starting with the PMR, sharing regulations, ancillary service regulations, DSM, and now GNA. These components we want to freeze and then work back on the grid code. And so grid code is being also, draft is being finalized. In probably in few days or weeks, we will notify the draft grid code, which will incorporate all the essence of all these regulations. And that is why if you look at the ancillary services regulation and the DFCN regulations, though we have notified, we have not notified the effective date. We're doing fully well, they will make it effective when the grid code is put in place, because otherwise there will be internal inconsistencies and it will not flow gel together. So we are aware of it. It is the way that we worked around it. And maybe in the hindsight, it was better because once you have a grid code which basically deals with the essence and then you notify it, then you're bound by the grid code view that you have taken in individual regulations. We thought that let's look at the individual regulations independently, freeze it, and then take out and then put it back into grid code, and you will come out with the grid code. So that is being done. So all these notifications has been done, but the effective date has not been notified. We are fully aware that as and when the commission decides the effective date, by that time at least the grid code, draft grid code should be out, so that you know that everything fits into the framework and there is no internal inconsistency. So that is being taken care of. As you are aware that CERC has taken out the draft notification on the GNA. We have asked for the comments, suggestions, and the public hearing also has been done. And so at the moment, all the comments that has been received are under review of the commissions. And there are a couple of issues, as was pointed out, which needs to be addressed. And hopefully in a very short time, we will notify the regulation. So before I get to the little bit of detailing part, again, one more point that I tend to agree with what Mr. Shahi observed. Neither the act nor the regulations can always be perfect or ideal. I mean, it basically tries to address the larger issues based on the historical experience that we had. Now, take specifically the connectivity regulations of 2010, n number of amendments has been done to that regulations. And in fact, I mean, jokingly, if you look at the procedure under the regulations, the procedure has much more meat than the regulation itself. So we have come to a situation now, almost the procedure notified under the connectivity regulations are almost like a regulations, and it has undergone n number of changes. So that was done to address the issues as and when it came up. But now that we know at least the RE penetration, the other type of new technology that is coming in, the transformation that is taking place in the power sector, keeping that in mind, we thought that is better to have rework the whole issue and look at from a different perspective, considering the experience that we had in the past. Is also what Mr. Shahi tried to highlight, and I tend to agree. The CERC is mandated to balance the interests of various stakeholders. And unlike in many other regulations where the obligations and liability is on bilateral basis, you have a PPA with a generating company, so you have bilateral obligations and responsibility. The way we have structured the transmission system in our country and then frame the sharing regulation, it's sort of I call it very crudely a zero-sum game, because you recover all the transmission charges and into a pool and then apportion it. So somebody's gain is always somebody's loss, and somebody's loss is always somebody's gain. So this is how it is. And in this scenario, it is always the responsibility, I do agree, it is responsible to the CERC and all the stakeholders, CERC, to ensure that the the view that CRC takes or the regulation that or framework that it puts in place balances the interest of all the stakeholders. And I do admit that it's not always we meet the expectations of each individual stakeholders. It's not possible to do so. But I understand that to a large extent, we do balance the interest, and it becomes acceptable with a little bit of give and take, because obviously we can't satisfy, as I mentioned, since a zero-sum game, it can't, everybody's expectations can't be satisfied. So it is a little bit of compromise that we expect each stakeholders to do in the interest of the system. So GNA also has been drafted in that background and with that understanding. And if you look at GNA, many of the salient features of the GNA that has been proposed in the GNA have already been brought in some way, directly, indirectly, in various of the various regulations that has been notified by the Commission, and then the procedure that has been notified by the Commission. For example, one example I'll give you. In the sharing regulation, we introduced the concept of billing at the draw end. And we put a provision saying that whatever may be your arrangement as per your contract, we will bill you at the draw end. You make your internal arrangement for settling the account. And so that is the essence that we brought in the sharing regulation. Now that is the base when the GNA comes in. I mean, so many of the things that we brought in here were already introduced, thought about it, introduced in earlier regulations. So even look at the connectivity procedures we modified in about 1.5 years back. Many of the things we put in place in those modified regulations, procedures are now part of the GNA. So we had done that, knowing fully well that we will finally take it to the regulations and put in the regulations. So it is an ongoing process, and these regulations do not come in bits and pieces and in isolation. It is always the flow, and we keep in mind, and then certain concept that we do introduce in earlier regulations, it makes its inroad into the regulations, but we are fully aware of what we do, so that how does it impact in the future regulations. One more example I'll give you, very, very interesting. When we did the DSM regulations were there in the earlier one, and we did the amendment. We delinked the vector price and linked it to the market price, MCP, in the earlier amendment. Now that has been now captured in the modified DSM regulations. So these are the elements that we introduced in the last 4-5 years, doing fully well where we want to move in future, and now those have been captured. So it is an ongoing process, and a lot of testing do go on. For a commission, it is interesting because when you introduce these small items, we test the market, we test the behavior of the stakeholders, and it gives us confidence saying that, okay, we will bring it in the regulations. Even in the RTM regulations, when we brought in RTM, the right to recall, if you see right to revision, 4 to 6 time block, we shifted to 7 to 8 time blocks. So that again, it looks very innocuous in small, but it has an implication somewhere else. So these are the things we have been doing. I mean, it gets accepted at some point of time. It gives us confidence saying that, okay, we can go ahead and do it. So again, how does it interplay with the grid code that is to be notified future? I mean, that's again is a issue. So a lot of these small key, I call it small, but there are very, very key points that we have introduced in the last many years in different small regulations and procedures, and tested the views of the stakeholders and whether it has been accepted, not accepted, whether it created any problem. And that gives us confidence to really go onto a larger issue. So having said so, this point also was made by Mr. Sardana that the whole philosophy of the proposed GNA is now, in my way, I mean, the way I looked at it, is based on demand driven, in the sense that earlier the philosophy of was supply push. Like, for example, an injecting entity shall be given connectivity to inject power, which shall be its GNA. So he gets connectivity, and that equivalent to the GNA, and it doesn't require any contract nor identify customer to do so. A drawing entity will be given access, which will be his GNA, based on the requirement of the drawing projected in advance, so that the system can be planned and access can be given effective from the date that the drawl entity wants to. So it is always the drawl entity which will be indicating is GNA, and that becomes the basis for I understand the planner now to factor in and build the system, and not on the LTA that the generating company comes, looks for a buyer, and then based on that some planning takes place. Yes, when the generator comes, it needs connectivity, which is very specific to the generator. Some system needs to be built so that the connectivity has to be given, and that is very specific to the generator. So that the whole ATS is very specific to the generator, and that's why the liability of the generator is that if it doesn't come, that particular component remains, which is specific to the generator, becomes redundant. That's why the bank guarantee and everything is tied up. And only commitment we want is that if you want to, you said that you are coming, you come. If you don't come, then you get the penalty. So that's how it is. And so the philosophy is changed. Also, we try to simplify the many of the issues that we faced in the old connectivity regulations. The n number of petitions, there are lack of clarity. Not that I blame anybody else, but then things change so fast. Probably we sitting in 2010, 12, 13, 14, we couldn't anticipate the things the sector will move, and we never put in place those features. So that's created difficulties for the commissions through various orders, though it was not part of the regulations. Through various orders, try to solve those issues. Through procedure, we try to solve these issues, though it was accepted, but purely from legalistic point of view, and since these are a lot of commercial implications are there, those ad hoc decisions, I call it ad hoc, though legally is correct. Commission has the regulatory power, general regulatory power, when nothing is provided anywhere else. The commission does exercise the general regulatory power to decide certain matters, and that becomes the law. But then we thought that whatever learning that we had, what are the difficulties that we faced, whatever the issues that came before us during in the form of petitions, and the decisions that we took, that should be codified very properly and put in the regulation. So we have tried to address all those issues that came before us because of the dynamic nature of the power sector and the drastic changes that took in the sector, which probably the existing regulations did not anticipate and then provide for them. So we try to address it. Yes, as I mentioned earlier, no regulations are perfect. There could be a lot of bridges we need to clarify to the best of our ability. But also at the same time, all the stakeholders, I always appeal saying that we can't meet expectations of every individual group of stakeholders. It is a give and take. So we can have the best possible solutions. Maybe for an individual stakeholder, it can't be the best solution, then it's the second best solution. But then for the system as a whole, probably the best solution, because it has to take care of interest of all the stakeholders. So we will try to do that. And comments have come. Some of the comments have come, and we'll try to address it. But one thing at least this commission takes we take pride in telling that in all the regulations that we have notified, in the comment that has come, nobody has raised the issue at all, saying that there is an absolute lack of clarity or this thing. It is just that the viewpoint do come in saying that I need this particular benefit or somebody else this benefit or this needs to be, but there are no issues coming up at all, internal inconsistencies or there is general lack of clarity. Those issues are not there, because we do take care and spend n number of hours reading and making it as consistent and as clear as possible, with minimum words and sentences without using any extra word, so that it doesn't create any confusion. So most of our regulations you find are very, very crisp. In fact, one comment that came is that your regulations are so crisp is become difficult. I mean, we use the minimum words, whatever word is there. Of course, it has its own limitations. When you become very crisp, it doesn't convey all the meaning that you want to convey. So, but then we thought that there's better way than writing very elaborate regulations. So our regulations are very, very crisp. If you look at the sentences, also very, very clear, either shall be done or not shall be done. We don't use a may also in many cases. Absolutely, we have avoided many mays. So that everybody is aware of what is the obligations and responsibility. And in that sense, the relinquishment charges do come in instead of calculating what is the standard capacity, you estimate the standard capacity and do it. We say upfront you decide. So everybody, once my liability is known upfront, I can factor in, play around with that. If I'm in uncertain situation, I don't know what is my liability. Any businessman, if I don't know what is my liability, I have a problem. But if I know the liability upfront, at least I in a position to address it and mitigate it. I'll build into my business model. So we always have tried to say that let's make it as certain as possible so that everybody knows on the day one what is going to happen, instead of leaving it open and the way the commission will decide. Last time also our regulation provided for the standard capacity. We didn't provide a methodology of standard capacity. We, after so much of struggle in 92 MP, we did come out with a methodology of estimating standard capacity. It creates problem because nobody knew how it is to be measured. So when you provide a regulation, you should at least tell, this is how it has to be measured or this is how it has to be done. We can't keep it open-ended. So we have closed those gaps to the best of our ability. If any issues or any open gaps are there, which has been pointed out by the stakeholders, we will address it. At least to that extent, we will try to clean this. We want to make all the regulations very, very clear so that no open-endedness is there. It may not be to the best of expectations of some of the stakeholders, but we will not leave that uncertainty in the sense that at least on the day one, we'll tell this is what is supposed to be. So many of the points have been highlighted by Mr. Sardana, key points, and so I'll also like to highlight some of the points which may be a repetition, but I still feel that it is worthwhile because these are quite important, and from development of not only the transmission sector but for market development and the way the transmission system or the transmission system or the behavior of the entities will take place. So as was pointed out by Mr. Sardana, the first thing we did is that the states will be able to schedule power under long-term, medium-term or short-term contract based on their own assessment of merit order on day-ahead basis within the GNA quantum. So there's flexibility is coming. You are not bound by that LTA is there, and then you can't have a short-term. Within that, they can play around with that. So this flexibility has built it. Of course, any drawal beyond GNA will draw deviation charges, so additional charges will come. Then we have indicated how the first GNA will be assigned to each state. We have given a methodology. There are some comments which come. There are other alternative methodology also was available, but we found that since it is a drawal and which actually has happened over the last 3 years, it is a factual number. Nobody can challenge or nobody can question saying that this number is wrong. And this actually has happened, and this is how the states have behaved. So we saw that that number is the best because this is all recorded, this is all on the record. So we took that, and on basis of that we said that this is the starting point of the GNA. Then we give a flexibility saying that okay, you can additional GNA you want to take, you can ask for it, and subject to availability in the margin or subject to new system coming in, it will be given. Then as I also was mentioned, already mentioned that the payment of GNA charges, how it will be done, it will be on a drawal basis by the drawing entity will be paid. The GNA and connectivity by the generating companies, we say that they will be connected, they will pay for the ATS that is to be provided for the connectivity as bank guarantee, and for GNA charges will not be payable by the generating company. There are rationale that has been given. It can be debated. People have raised questions also on that. But anyway, that's our view. So we depending on what the comment that has come, we will take a view on that, but that is broadly has been provided for, and there is a large support for that. There are relinquishment provisions has also been provided, both in part and full. And as I mentioned earlier, the looks high, and we don't know whether that is standard capacity or no standard capacity. But then in this whole regulations, we have removed the whole concept of standard capacity. So the question, so that's why we say that upfront we make the payment. Whether 60 times is correct or comments have come whether 40 times is correct, but that's a separate issue. But point is that yes, you make it certain what is the liability, and so everybody factors it in the day one, and there's less uncertainty. And we have provided for temporary GNA again, which is like almost akin to STOA and MTOA. But it is again much more flexible than present STOA, where the scheduling was 3 months in advance. Now the scheduling you can do it in day ahead. Basically you can, but also we have provided for in 11 months you can book a corridor. So booking a corridor is one part, scheduling is one part. Scheduling flexibility is already been provided now, so you are not bound by like in the present STOA, you are bound by your schedule 3 months ahead. You have got flexibility till the last day. So those flexibility has been brought in. We say that we have no problem about managing it. I mean, the system operator are equipped enough, and information are there to address these issues if the scheduling changes takes place. I mean, that is, why should you bind somebody for 3 weeks, 3 months ahead scheduling? You can change it depending on the scenario changing, and our system is quite capable of adapting to those changes. There, as in the connectivity also, we said that we put the threshold of minimum 50%, 50 megawatt, but we have also provided a lot of other things, like you can tag along with somebody else's bay, you can ride on somebody else's dedicated line, you can but based on your commercial arrangement. So we leave it to you. We say we don't get into the regulator or the system operator will not get into it. It is purely a commercial arrangement between two parties. If you want to share any of your infrastructure, you do so. It is your commercial arrangement. You come back and to us, system operator will take it on. So we have provided those. So we have, in many cases, if you look at, we ask the system operator or the regulator not to get into the pure commercial aspects of between two parties. The common assets that has been provided or being developed by the system operator or the CTU, we need to address that. How it to be used by two parties, if it is owned by the CTU, that we need to address that. But if something has been developed by a private party, he wants to share it, how we going to share it? So those flexibility we have provided. Second, also, if you look at the transfer of connectivity, transfer of GNA, we made it very, very flexible, and absolutely, I think almost we allowed the transfer on subject to one condition. I think we written about COD. I think that's the only thing we limited. Rest all, the whole connectivity and GNA can be transferred between the subsidiaries and SPVs. So idea was that, as in the beginning I told, factor in the new developments and the dynamics that is coming into the power sector. Do away with the difficulties and issues that we faced in the past based on the past regulations, which was much before when all those changes did take place. Try to bring in as much clarity as possible, without much of an openness, in the sense that it close the issue so that everybody knows precisely what is the liability and what is they're supposed to do or not do, and make it as simple as possible. That was the whole purpose of framing these regulations. And my understanding and the comment that came is that we have been successful in that direction to a large extent. Yes, there are issues about whether the liability is higher, liability is low, who should bear the liability. I mean, those issues will remain. As I said, in this whole transmission system, it is always the gain of somebody is the loss of somebody, and this is going to happen. This debate will continue. So now that these comments have come, the commission will take a view on that. But before I end, I like to just one of the feeling that comes before this commission in various issues that comes through the petition is there's always a feeling of when the discom versus the generator. Now, most of the petitions it comes that generator, the line was made for the generator has not come up, and we are loaded on with these transmission charges. So those debate is always there in each petition. These issues do come up. So also there is a need to work around this, and we need your help or assistance to, or even your good officers to discuss the philosophy that in the GNA we have brought in, saying that it is the drawl entity who for whom the system is built. Because if you're injecting in entities maybe the 500 gigawatt, but your demand is to 300 gigawatt, should I build a line for 500 gigawatt or should I build a system for 300 gigawatt? So it is a drawl entity. So basically we need to look at injection. Maybe you have a capability to inject into the system, maybe simultaneously all those 500 gigawatt not get injected into the system. So this debate that comes to always is generator versus discoms. At every petition they do come up. So we need to. So the GNA has tried to at least move towards there to this thing, and there are issues that has been raised by the discoms and RPCs on this issue specifically, saying that that the generators are basically have no liability. They don't have any liability in future. I mean that point has been very vocally brought up before the commission. So we need to address that, because I, as a commission or as a chairman of CERC, I always believe that whatever you do, you have to take. These are all stakeholders. We have to take everybody along, and we try to convince everybody, saying that yes, this is how you look at it. And we had our internal, we had our one-to-one discussion with all the discoms in region-wise and with all the RPCs. We brought these issues before them. But I think still there is a feeling, general feeling that most of the generators are they don't have any liability. I mean, that's the word they use. And so whether the GNA succeeds, doesn't succeed, fails, doesn't work, again, it depends on those viewpoints and that prevails in the field. So if you want GNA to succeed, I think we need to work on that. Not that I blame this thing or this thing, but this is a viewpoint, and everybody has their own right. Everybody is right. We don't say any viewpoint is correct. It is from their viewpoint they're absolutely correct. Maybe if I'm a discom, I also say the same thing. But I think we need to convince, saying that yes, we need to get out of that viewpoint. Maybe it is correct, but come to a national level and then take a correct position. I mean, that's it. You don't say any viewpoint is wrong. We say that yes, we respect your viewpoint. That's how CERC always does. We say every viewpoint is correct, but then point is that I cannot accommodate all the viewpoints into one particular regulations. So we need to make compromises and for the best interest of the system. So you had to forego a little bit. So that's my request is that since all of you are very experienced and in this field and you are working on that, this needs to be. Yeah, Mr. Sardana is I think he's wearing both the hats, so he can you try to help us through there. But I presume that as and when GNA gets notified, and it will clear a lot of issues, and maybe in the initial phase when you transit from the existing system to the new system, there will be issues. But interesting is that our whole chapter of transition, the full chapter of transition we have put in, and no comments have come. I think we are absolutely thrilled that I mean the transition that we have provided for, I think largely is accepted, and the amount of effort we went to put in that chapter was too much, because we didn't know how to deal with that. I mean, it's too complicated. And number of, if you look at the type of cases, LTA granted, not effective, LTA not granted, application pending, effective, not operationalized, all sorts of things are there. So anyway, but that has been largely accepted. We don't have much of comment on that. So that's major part is taken care of. It's all those that core issues also there, this thing, it is all those peripheral issues, and then harmonizing various other provisions, that where the issues are. I think we need to address those issues. But thank you so much for having organized this seminar and inviting me to speak. But your experience is much more, and then you with the practical on the field, you know what are the difficulties. So we can make a regulations, but when it gets implemented, it has its own issues. So since it is a major regulation, and both CTU and system operators and policymakers, CA, will have to align there, or maybe modify a little bit the way we had done our business earlier. We need to change and then align ourselves to the new concept. But ultimately, I think the system will gain. But anyway, CRC is open to any viewpoints, and then we are responsive. Whatever points come, we try to address it. Thank you so much. Thank you, Mr. Shahi, Mr. Sardana, Mr. Bhamani. Thank you so much for inviting me. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Popley. Thank you very much, sir, Mr. Pujari ji. And you made a very valid point. Everyone has a valid views, but while everybody may be right, but you as a CRC have to take a view which is the best out of it. Second is, we are sure that GNA Act, when it comes, will soothe certain other issues which are still holding it. So thank you very much, sir. You will continue joining us, or we will have now panel discussion of the experts. Unmute yourself. Yeah.
No, I think I'll be there for some time because I got some other thing also. You carry on.
Okay. Thank you very much.
If I'm there, I'll be there for some time, but I don't know.
Thank you very much, sir. So we will now start with the panel discussion.
Let me Bhamani Sahab steer this panel discussion.
Yeah.
So thank you, Mr. Pujari. The accolades are in order. I think it was a beautiful set of points that you made, and the entire thing really weaved itself into a beautiful fabric. So thank you so much. Let me quickly move on to the 5 panelists that we have for the day. We will allocate about 30 minutes for this now in view of the slight delay. I would request each speaker to make his points for about 6 minutes so that we can accommodate that in 30 minutes. I will start. We will go in the following order. We will have first Mr. Ghanshyam Prasad. Then we will have Mr. Shrikant, the chairman of PGCIL, to speak. Then we will have Mr. Bhaskar Sawant, who's the Principal Secretary Power for Government of Rajasthan. We will then take Mr. Barpanda, who is the Director from POSOCO. And last, we will have the private sector nominee, Mr. Devanand, who's the Power System Control Center expert from Tata Power. So may I request Mr. Ghanshyam Prasad, our colleague from Ministry of Power, to give his expert views. Over to you, Mr. Ghanshyam Prasad.
Good morning to everyone. And thanks for giving me this opportunity to address this August gathering and all experts in the group. I think I have been hearing since morning, and right from the context setting that was done by Shri Anil Sardana ji, and then by Shahi sir, and the detailed point of view which was expressed by CERC, chairperson CERC. I think as a policymaker, I don't have much to add, but definitely at this point of time, I'll say that it was a long-awaited reform that was required into the system. And I think it has taken around 8 years to come to this point. And since कहते हैं सागर मंथन जब होता है तो you get amrit. So I think after 8 years of sagar manthan, probably we have got some nectar, and that is going to be for the benefit of the power sector. And as rightly pointed out, it leads to a lot of good efforts in the areas of ease of doing business. It has also been pointed out that it is going to be consumer centric. That is moving from point to point concept to a generalized concept, wherein there will be a flexibility for from the both side, from the generator side as well as from the discom side or the consumer side as such. Rightly mentioned about the enablers for the power market, and since the sector itself, power sector itself, is transiting from earlier concept to a market-based concept. So it's going to be a good enabler to lead to that kind of situation. Maybe, and since I'm also involved in the ministry from the reform side or the policy making side, so I know the pain points what a policy maker has. And so is the case with any regulator who enters into a zone of uncertainty and takes all the risk to himself when they or we as such a policy makers, we try to formulate. And that goes without saying that we know the problems of the sector. We sit over the problems, try to analyze those problems, try to find a solution which is innovative, nowhere written in any text. That innovation sometimes works, sometimes doesn't work. If it works, it's good. If it doesn't, then you again restart the process to take the journey. And that is how we have been reforming this power sector for last so many years. And most recently, a number of measures have been taken. And I particularly feel that the reforms pertaining to transmission in particular with GNA is a major reform, and this is going to lead us to a lot of development, particularly seeing from the perspective of renewable energy additions which will be happening in the country, from the perspective of certainty that has been provided in the rules as well as in the regulations of CERC. And as rightly has been pointed out, that there is a lot of clarity now in how the things are going to be planned, how it has to be interchanged, and how it has to be used, and how the mechanism of sharing sectors will take place. Of course, there are 4 or 5 issues that was pointed out, and I think they are genuine and they are under deliberations, and they can also be resolved, but with a different magnitude and with different challenges which does have into the system. Particularly one of the point that was pointed out by Mr. Shahi also is regarding the cross-border transactions, which has not been adequately addressed into the system. I know there are challenges into the cross-border, and there are nuances and there are strategic concerns which needs to be considered before we enter into this particular zone of giving any kind of approval or any kind of simplification in the approval mechanism. I know there are scopes. There are a lot of scopes in simplifying the procedure, but because of the present nuances, I think the things are under hold at the moment. But definitely going forward, a policy which is very good policy and the best policy at the time when it is notified. But what happens is slowly as we go along and try to use the policy, we find that a number of changes and more amendments are required either in the rules or regulations, or even if I say majorly in the act as well. So those happens because of the dynamics of the system and the dynamics of the sector in which it is transiting to. So I think we all are privy to all these dynamism, and we keep on making the rules, regulations, and changing the policies, etc., etc. And at the end, I'll only say that this GNA is going to be quite helpful for the sector. I'll stop here. Thank you so much.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for maintaining the time besides everything else. And thanks for all those remarks. You rightly said that, after a lot of deliberation, the nectar seems to be now flowing the right way, and we seem to be indeed. And, I think aligning with the thoughts that Chairman CRC made, eventually from the DISCOM's perspective, they can never have a grouse here and after to say that this is the entire thing which is going to be dependent on how they do a demand projection right, and therefore draw the benefit of the whole thing being ultimately oriented and designed for their benefit. Well said. May I have Mr. Shrikant? I must thank him. He was traveling. I made a personal request that wherever he was, if he could join in from there, which he readily agreed. So therefore, it'll be lovely to hear your views. Please go ahead, Mr. Shrikant.
A very good morning to all, respected Chairperson CERC, Shri Pujari, President IEF, Shri Shahi, and all the senior colleagues and participants in today's webinar. I would like to thank the IEF for giving this opportunity to speak on this occasion. I think a very, very brief recap sort of on what the transmission has been in serving this power sector, Indian power sector. We have one nation, one grid at one frequency, a very strong national grid that is the platform for operating this 400 gigawatts of generation capacity nearly that we have today, and meeting the 200 gigawatt of peak demand, and facilitating 110 gigawatt of inter-regional transfer capacity. This is the third largest transmission system in the world, and significant growth has taken place in this network. So the framework which was in place to create this network for the growth of this network has indeed served well. We have development of the market, the congestion of the volume of electricity stranded has significantly reduced. The congestion charges are also indicative of that. We have cross-border transactions with imports from Bhutan, exports to Nepal and Bangladesh. So all this the grid has served. And if we look at the regime that has developed, of course, certain things are inherent characteristics of this, that there is a strong reliance on contract and contract path, point-to-point transfer of power, and then ISTS augmentation primarily triggered by demand for LTA. That is, I think, one of the major features of this system, which perhaps is has outlived its utility. So the change which is being brought about, or which is being debated, the GNA system, I think one of the major drivers which has been spoken by the previous speakers as well is the clean energy transition. The focus on renewables, the need to, or the target of 500 gigawatts of capacity from non-fossil energy sources. I think these are the short gestation of the RE projects. These are some of the critical points which require a change in the way we look at transmission, the way we, and also the learnings of this period. So we have also a greater tilt towards markets, the increase in short-term transactions, the need for a system to cater to medium-term or short-term transactions. The people want to get out of PPAs and switch to market, particularly because of the lower cost renewables. So all these are some of the drivers for the shift to a new system of transmission network development, I would say that. I won't go through so much of these GNA features. These have been dealt adequately by Mr. Sardana as well as the chairperson CERC. I think, but the most important point is that it will enable any point to any point transfer of power. So if we, this is the most fundamental thing, that the flexibility to procure power from any source within certain aspects, and also the draft regulations cover energy storage systems, then connectivity through existing electrical system generator, transfer of connectivity, connectivity for bulk consumers, dual connectivity, and so on. These are some of the things. Now, one of the aspects which has been driving the development or behind the development of the transmission network has always been kind of who will pay for the system. I think this is one of the major issues which has been. So the LTA, for example, is the driver that, okay, the one who takes LTA will pay for it, or if there is a firm PPA, they pay for it. So I think one of the key features or key questions always in the development of transmission network is who will pay for the system. But the time has come for to look, in my view, to plan for the system as an independent requirement for the entire grid as such. Always the national electricity policy talks of transmission being, the system being ahead of generation. The rules which have been framed recently for transmission system planning, development and recovery of interstate transmission charges rules 2021, they also talk of transmission ahead of generation, of course with the caveat that it should be not lead to wasteful investments. That is a implicit given. Can we think of delinking the generator from the transmission? Not generation, but the generator. Because if we look at it, there is always an obligation on the generator that, okay, what happens if he doesn't come? What happens? So you get into these systems of taking guarantees, taking commitments, charges, and so on. But if we look at as a collective, generation will come. If there is demand, there will be generation. If we want flexibility, there will be multiple sources of generation. If, for example, we have 500 gigawatts of capacity, maybe 300 gigawatts of demand, there will be flexibility. There is an option to go from one or the other source, which is economically cheaper to the utility. So the flow for generation is required, but it may not be a generator. So there should be some system that if a generator doesn't come within a given time, rather than wait for his full schedule, we can look at some milestones and delink him. I mean, take curtail or cancel his connectivity, take him off and cache his limited BGs and so on, and make the corridor available for somebody else. So if we do that, perhaps the growth of the transmission network can be ahead of generation. It can be independent of these individual generators, and to that extent, it will reduce the overall cost of consumers' cost of electricity, because the generators need not build all these into their cost of electricity production. And then the issue of contractual risk sharing and defined liabilities, which has been well pointed out by the chairman CERC as well, and Mr. Sardana in his context setting remarks. The risk sharing has to be defined in the contracts. And the liabilities, the current draft regulations also go in that direction, and they provide for defined liabilities. But there are certain still aspects which are not, which may require more clarity in terms of what happens to the liabilities of the transmission licensee for delays, or what happens if the generator doesn't come, and so on. I think these need to be seen more from a contractual perspective and defined, so that, as the chairperson has also mentioned, before entering the contract, one knows clearly what the liabilities are, and that will be giving them an opportunity to price them into the cost of those services. And finally, we need to perhaps look at the possibility of shifting away from the interstate, intrastate division at the time of transmission network planning. Maybe this is the time to go for, I believe, a national transmission system planning, because ultimately, if the electricity has to reach the end consumers through the state network, and there are mismatches between the interstate and the intrastate network, the purpose will not be served. It will not be fully realized. I think at the level of planning, definitely there is a need to integrate these and make it right up to 132 kV or 220 kV level, including the intrastate system. One homogeneous national transmission system planning that, in my view, would optimize the investment in transmission and facilitate better implementation of this flexibility in access to different sources of energy, to different sources of generators for the benefit of the end consumer. So I'll stop here. And once again, thank you all for giving this opportunity.
Thank you, Shrikant. Appreciate your using the slides and making things more clearer for the benefit of all listeners and bringing out all those points, especially the last point, which is, I guess, somewhere gets lost in the din in this entire concurrent subject melee. The fact of the matter is that the state transmission system is one of the very weak link today in terms of eventually delivering, as you said, rightly, the benefits to the end customers. So I completely agree with that point. And I guess it's important that we should look at some bigger perspective rather than having those fuzzy lines that exist today. Thank you once again. We move on to the next speaker. May I request Mr. Bhaskar Sawant to make his remarks, because it'll be nice to hear as to what eventually the states and the DISCOM, as Chairperson also said, view this subject in terms of how this will pan out for them. So over to you, Mr. Bhaskar.
Respected Pujari sir, Chairperson of the CERC, respected R.V. Shahi sir, President of Indian Forum of Energy, and other distinguished personalities in the field of power sector. Today I am not here as an expert participant, but I will definitely try to explain things as seen from important stakeholder, and maybe you can term as a weak link. That stakeholder is STU as well as DISCOMs. So first of all, first concern about GNA as seen from DISCOM or STU point of view that I would like to flag is that so far there is a very little exposure to officials of STU and DISCOM about GNA. Barring one or two small seminar officers, they have not got enough exposure and discussions, and unless they are kept in loop, there is likelihood of having so many rightly founded or wrongly founded doubts about the change that is going to happen. And if not disruptive, this is substantial change that much everybody is admitting. So points as seen from point of SQ, I have flagged 2-3 points. First is, along with the GNA, we should also go for state GNA. And this point, I think CMD PGCIL rightly pointed out that switching to national transmission system planning, because points raised by my technical persons, they are saying that if there are no GNA charges for generators and there is no limit, no cutoff as far as renewable energy producer is concerned, they are obviously likely to get attracted to CTO as far as connection is concerned, and that is likely to disturb level playing field between CTU and STU. So I think there has to be sufficient discussion, and this point can be get answered by making thorough discussion about switching to national transmission system planning. One more point, of course, this is a very small point, and this may be sub point. As I mentioned that there is mention of losing cross subsidy and other charges, but then as Pujara sir explained in depth, that there will be sacrifices to be done and gains to be achieved out of this system, and it will not be exactly possible to make perfect balance, but then golden mean will be achieved, and for that whatever suggestions are there, CERC is open to that, and that's very heartening. So this is second point. And ultimately decision about quantum setting, for example, for Rajasthan, I have been told that quantum is 5,700 megawatt. So there should be flexibility, because nobody knows how things are going to change. And for Rajasthan especially, which is a renewable rich state, this quantum setting thing, flexibility has to be there. So these are the few points, and most important point, as I mentioned right in the beginning, that there is feeling amongst the engineers and technical persons to whom I have discussed that this can be very useful. This will be optimization of overall investment done in network. But optimization done only from CTU point of view will be half done exercise, and optimization will be done or fully achieved if we are taking SQs along with CTU while planning or while making SNA, GNA. So first thing I would like to repeat that there has to be substantial exposure from CERC to stakeholders, SQs, their engineers and other decision makers, and then only they will be gradually able to respond. And unless that is done, and if they remain out of loop, it's almost impossible to go ahead despite the best intention and best drafting of the rules. This is what I would like to mention at this juncture, and I would like to thank Ariji for giving me the opportunity. Thank you.
Thank you, Bhaskar sir. This is indeed what is important for all of us as stakeholders to hear as to how the state views this. And as you rightly said, all of us for long years have been of the view that transmission system in the central sector has grown in a particular way, but it hasn't received similar amount of attention. Or even now you have even gone to the point, you use the word optimization. And you also use the word in terms of the fact that how do we take along the officials itself in the whole path to capacity building, training, etc., which has been again a subject which in the past has been discussed, including how the charges for that could be born out of the collections that were being made at the central level. So interesting points. I think it's still connecting our past and what we have been debating for several years. So thank you so much for those points of view. We really appreciate your joining. Could I now request the director of POSOCO to give his point of view, Mr. Panda, please.
Respected Chairperson CERC, Shahi sir, senior colleagues in the sector, and esteemed panelists and participants. So the previous speakers, including Chairperson CERC, Sardana sir, they have given overview of the GNA regulation, and I shall cover a few points. One is this GNA. It is a point-to-point based system, and whereas it will replace the injection, it will become a injection and trial based access. So this is a big ticket reform as far as transmission access is concerned, and this similar to this Electricity Act 2003. In 2003, this act replaced three acts governing the sector. Here we are going to replace two regulations. There is connectivity, LTA, MTY regulations, and open access regulations. So then supplementing what was said by earlier speakers, so there has been a paradigm shift since 2009. In 2009, we had this last connectivity regulation, and at that time, probably that was the appropriate regulation because more emphasis was on thermal sector. So thermal plants had to be encouraged, and so at that time, the provision of LTA by generator without target, with target region, with identified beneficiary, and payment of transmission charges by generators. All these provisions were there. Some issues were there, and we had pointed out the issues to the Honorable Commission. So now a major change is that most of the generators which are coming in the system, they are renewable generators. Then we have very few greenfield generators. Some thermal generators, they are being replaced. So brownfield generation, you can say. Then we have battery storage, some pump storage will come. So all this will change the entire sector. So in this new paradigm, it is the right step by CERC to say that charges will be shared mostly by the load serving entities. Okay. Coming to this regulation, that there are some challenges. I shall cover a few. One is this ATC TTC, available transfer capability and total transfer capability. So if you consider the figures as given in the draft regulation, ATC TTC of some of the states is lower than the GNA quantum. So now CTU and CA, all planners, they have to look into it, and they have to plan additional transmission systems so that power can be delivered to the entities securely. So secure operation is main policy of system operator. Then another point is this flexibility in GNA requirement. This, for example, this GNA provides flexibility in the access, but flexibility in contract is also required, because the generators, they will know slightly in advance, but not much in advance, what will be the requirement by the states. The flexibility has been given to the utilities. This flexibility has to be incorporated in the contracts so that there is no dispute at a later date. Then another issue can be this forecasting of GNA requirement, because this forecasting will be a challenge. Now the states, this will depend on merit order. Some of the states, they have their internal generation also. So what will be the internal generation as per merit order? What will be the requirement from outside? Then there will be many changes like renewable generation within the state, battery storage, pump storage within the state. Then EV will change the entire scenario. So all these changes will change the forecasting, and states will have to be very diligent in forecasting, because if the forecast a bit higher, then they will be burdened with higher transmission charges. If they forecast less, then transmission system will not be planned, and they will face difficulty in meeting their demand. So all these issues will be there. Then this anywhere, this 360-degree planning, that will be another issue to be seen by the planners, because no, earlier it was point-to-point planning. So now it will be 360 degrees. So any generator can sell power to anybody, and any drawing entity can draw power from anybody. So planning will be become more difficult, because they have to factor in different scenarios. Say for example, now recently we had this coal shortage. Imported coal was not available. In some part of the country, this imported generation has gone down. So sometimes it may show up and that some flooding in coal mine is there. So some pithead generation will not be there, or in some case, some low hydro. So all these scenarios have to be considered, and planning has to be done. So finally, this NOR is going to be operational shortly, and we look forward to implement this GNA regulation. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Bharpanda. That was very useful. In fact, some of these very important technical points will ultimately also need a thorough analysis on the cost paradigms. I think one aspect that we have missed out today, because we have gone into the regulations part and we have gone into the technicalities, but we haven't ultimately touched on the point that when we talk about general access, what would it mean in terms of eventual cost? Because the network will have to be strengthened now in terms of the demand profile to be met in a very, very flexible way. So I think some of those very useful points. Thank you so much for joining. I really appreciate. Can I now request the last speaker, and considering that we have 6 minutes left before 12:30, may I request Mr. Devanand to make his point. Tata Power, which itself is also in all the various aspects, and they wear the hat of being a discom, a generator, as also a transco. So therefore, how do they see the GNA perspective? So over to you, Mr. Devanand.
Respected Chairman CERC and President IEF, Shahi. Thank you for giving me opportunity to present the aspect regarding this GNA. First of all, this regulation per se brings out how matured we are becoming as a power system. Because today the responsibility in GNA actually handles, it's like who is going to pay for the highway? Will be the bus operator or the passengers? So we are very clearly saying that the highway would be made for all the bus operators who are going to come in. So in one sense, it relieves any generators or to that extent, discoms be responsible for the development of the transmission system. I think more or less the regulation gives good aspects to all the generator as well as discoms, though some points here and there is missed out, which most of the speakers have covered up. I would just tell one specific point, which is going to be, which seemingly may be very difficult for the planners, because now, as Pujari sir had said, that this is more of a demand-driven network preparation, right? So it also says, as Mr. Bapanda had also said, the key focus would be on the forecast, and forecast from the demand side. Now, demand side, today the big challenge is, do everybody have the same visibility in terms of what's the demand going to be, especially with prosumers and distributed generation, EVs coming in. And since this is all adding up from bottom up. First, the input should come from DISCOM, then to STU, and then it goes to the main planners. So this would be a real challenge in how the planning is going to take place, how DISCOMs and the state level entities ensure that the proper data is captured for planning. Because if we go into the past also, the planning has had the challenges in terms of getting the data from the base user level. And I think that will be one of the challenge which is going to come up, and possibly also, these regulations which are basically addressing the efficiencies, or you can say the efficient way of utilizing as well as optimizing the cost to the consumers as well as to the generator. So this will become very important, that what are the resources which are put in place to capture data, to ensure that proper forecasting, proper assessment is done, what is required, so that these regulations, the essence of the regulations are actually met. I think that is enough from my side, Satana Sahib. I think I won't take much time in repeating, I think, all the August gatherings inputs which has come. So thank you very much, sir.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Devanand. That, in fact, is the essence of this GNA. And as you rightly said, the demand side planning is very critical. And I guess one would assume that we will evolve in this area as we go along, where like the way all good things eventually have to understand the importance of planning. And if we don't do the planning, then tomorrow DISCOMs and the planners can't complain that they weren't served right and they weren't served competitively and reliably. So I guess this GNA will eventually bring tremendous focus to that activity in terms of the fact that it has to, the demand side has to aggregate into the right kind of prediction. And therefore, GNA will be then able to address and give them the flexibility to source electrons from in a flexible way. So thank you so much. That brings us to the end of the panel discussion that we had. I'm happy to hand over to President Mr. Shahi and for him to conduct the Q&A and give his part of remarks. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Anil. I think we are about 15 minutes late. No problem, we started about 10 minutes late. So we will have a couple of questions, 2-3 questions, and then we will sum up. Any comment on any of the presentations, any of the thoughts?
Sir, Rakesh ji has put 2 questions on the panel. So if you think it's okay, I can read, or if he wants to speak those questions, he can be unmuted.
Rakesh, are you there?
Yes,
Yeah,
yes,
he
I
can.
am.
Yeah, please go ahead.
So I have one general comment on the transmission planning. I think now the transmission planning will definitely be ahead of the generation in view of the low gestation period of the RE generation. The dedicated line will be built by the generator, and some of 1 or 2 lines may come with the connect when the generator seeks connectivity for evacuation of the generation. And it has to be a national transmission planning. And probably we are back to the old traditional planning where we used to do the planning based on the anticipated or long-term forecast for load and generation, and the probable generation pockets where probably generation is going to come. And specific questions on this GNA regulation is that about a existing power plant which is having connectivity for the installed capacity less the auxiliary consumption, and only part capacity LTA has been operationalized. So under the new regulations, the part LTA operationalized will be deemed GNA, and the generator will have to additional GNA for the balance capacity. So what happens if the associated transmission system is required to be built for the balance capacity? During the interim period, how will the generator evacuate the power? Because there is no mechanism stated in the regulation for this type of thing. And second is on your comment on the relinquishment. I don't think any existing generator, operational generator, will relinquish now, because the liability of the transmission is now on the DROIs, on the buyers, and not on the generators.
Perfect. The second one is perfect anyway, except that I basically meant for the new ones who seek.
If power plant is abandoned, then definitely.
Correct. Okay. The first one, of course, sir, as you know, that those comments have been part of the comments that CRC has received, and I'm sure we will soon hear their response on the first one, because this is very much part of the ones which were agitated during the public discussion also.
No, I think we will, at the end of it, we will summarize some of the suggestions that we make from here. So let's be specific about it, like some of the limitations that Anil made, that what happens when transmission constraints emerge and how do we handle that? That part is, but then just now what Rakesh said, that see, you have connectivity that is taken by the generators, and you have the discoms which have to pay for the draws, and their draws will come much later. How the long-term planning ahead of transmission will happen, I do not know whether this document addresses this question. Should it address this question? That would be the issue, because general network access, I would definitely feel that this document is the right document to create a new chapter. How will it happen? Because what I glanced through, unless I have missed certain part, it provides for generators to approach the authority for connectivity. That will come much later, much later. And then distribution people will pay, and they will have access to the transmission system, and their payment according to tariff and all that happens will be based on draw. So these two events are very much subsequent to the need for transmission planning ahead. And I fear that if this document does not address it and obliges some instruments to do it, like said CTU, and just now we discussed STU. STU is totally disconnected with this. with central level transmission, national grid will happen, but the state level doesn't happen. I have a current experience of Nepal, where 1,000 megawatt of system we have connected between Muzaffarpur and Dhalkewar, but the local transmission, sub-transmission has not happened. They hardly draw 270 megawatt. So these are some of the missing points. I would feel that if it has covered, very good. If it has not covered, there needs to be a mechanism. But anyway, any other question?
I want to give on your
Yeah.
When the generator apply for the connectivity, the CTU will do the total transmission planning, associated transmission planning required not just for connecting that plant, but also for evacuation of that plant to the load centers. So they will take into account the future demand of the distribution companies, and then they will run the system studies based on the future demand and then plan the system. So ATS will also not just consist of the evacuation line connected to the power plant, but the lines beyond that for evacuation of that power up to the load centers.
No, Rakesh, what I'm saying, it has to be even ahead of that. Because he will approach only when he has put his places, that environmental clearance, land, etc. Long-term transmission planning. Long-term transmission planning has to be on demand projection.
Yeah, that long-term planning will be based on the projected and that is going to come in future. So the basic transmission system will be developed based on the future demand, projected future demand of the states.
Yeah, okay.
Generation and likely pockets where generation.
Correct. So the question is whether this document addresses that.
Yeah, it doesn't. That is the point. It has to go into the planning code.
It has to be, the point is there has to be a chapter, because I am trying to create a future disconnect, that if we are talking of long-term transmission planning, also like people made a point, I think good point was made, that when we create highways, we create this and that. The point is it has to be even before a particular generator approaching the authority. I tell you, generator will approach the authority when he has put his house in order, maybe 4 years ahead of his generation. Transmission, like generation planning has to be done even before that. But so similarly, transmission planning has to be ahead of this. The only point there where I can suspect it will be a challenge, that should the generating company and transmission company continue to feel that everything should be de-risked. In no other business, de-risking desire is as much as in power business. I mean, nobody wants to take risk. So I think those aspects also have to come in the long-term future planning of transmission system. Another aspect that has to come, how STU get integrated into it, and what happens if they don't, because much will depend on what STU does at the state level. Firstly, STU has not been segregated from the, you see, states have not understood the spirit of the law. Transmission companies are not STU. There was an interim phase for power grid. Transmission companies are licensees. STU is a different set of thing. So CTU somehow we have succeeded to bring, and some degree of respect. I'm not very sure total degree of respect is there or not even now at the central level, but definitely something is there. Similar thing has to be replicated in the states. We must ensure that. I think CERC should ensure, Power Ministry should ensure. Then this document, I think this document can be a good document to introduce some of those changes, and then gets into the mechanics of who goes to apply and who pays what, etc. Any other comment?
Ghanshyam Prasad has raised his hand, sir.
Ghanshyam Prasad.
But he has to be unmuted.
Yeah, thank you, sir. In fact, the question that was raised regarding the planning, definitely it is going to be a challenge in the GNA. But what is required is the entire construct of change of concept of planning itself.
Correct.
And that construct right now, what we are doing is we are trying to make a 5-year plan. One set of planning is done and that lives and it doesn't get changed. So even though it is not there and not mentioned in any of the document or any of the regulations or grid code, etc., we have started that process of dynamic revision of the planning, transmission planning. And that has been started with CTU, and CTU has made a visibility of at least 5 years. And that will be that is going to be on a rolling basis, and on that rolling it will be revised every 6 months, depending on what I had planned, what actually came, or what new element has got added up, and what is the future requirement based on the dynamics of this entire situation, other than waiting for 5 years or 3 years or 2 years and then revise the plan. So that process has already started. First report is already out in that, and that has been hosted on the website as well. And this will happen every 6 months. So this is one way of tackling this issue. Second, what has also been done is basically in the transmission lines, the 2-3 major pain points are whether it is environmental clearance or the railway crossing or the highway crossing or any other multi-dimensional or which involves not only one utility but multiple utilities. So in that process, already mapping has started on the DPIIT portal that is coming under the PM Gati Shakti project. And all our ISTS, just for information of the entire people here, I'll just say that all our ISTS line, that is 1522, have been mapped into that portal. Each location wise it has been mapped. And those which are going to come in future is also getting mapped. So you precisely know from which area it is passing, whether, and for future, when I'm going to plan now, right now we didn't had any visibility when I am planning my transmission line. I didn't know this. It was just a 2 point. They used to say, okay, select from Vadodara to Lakhodia or something. And then you try to draw a straight line and go for a clearance. But once you go and try to implement that line, you find that either it is coming through a wildlife, or it is coming through a forest area, or it is crossing a number of highways or railways. A lot of issues used to be there. So right at the planning stage itself, all these will be visible, because in that PM Gati Shakti portal, you'll have a layer of all the railway infrastructure. You are going to have all the road infrastructure. You are going to have from the perspective of environment, that is in terms of whether it is covering a wildlife or it is going to cover a forest area or reserve forest area, etc., etc. So these are the two things which is going to happen in planning, right at the planning stage itself, which I thought I'll just share with the group.
No, thanks, Ghanshyam, thanks. A lot of things will be happening.
GNA regulation, sir, GNA regulation it may not be, I mean, you cannot put everything in the GNA regulation. Of course, CERC will take a call on that, but planning itself is a entirely a different ball game, which needs to be addressed in detail, and so that it becomes facilitated, particularly in view of the RE development and in that perspective. The two major objectives that is going to be there is how do I reduce the time for implementation, particularly in view of the clearances, etc., that I have. Second is I need to plan where it is used. So under these two construct, these two initiatives have been taken.
I agree with you that everything cannot be in GNA document, but GNA document today has a disconnect. That's the point that is emerging, like some of the speakers have said, that you are saying generator's responsibility begins when it applies for connectivity. And finally, investment is serviced when distribution companies draw power. Now the issue is, what happens if distribution companies and their sub-transmission STU and transmission companies have not done their job? And I gave you the example of Dhalkewar, Muzaffarpur, where 1000 megawatt has been invested to transmission and draw is 250 megawatt. So the question is, since how GNA gets connected, because GNA has established now by saying so, it has created a disconnect. So I think while GNA cannot deliberate or elaborate on transmission planning, but it must recognize and oblige CTU and along with CTU, STU to ensure that long-term transmission planning happens based on reasonable demand projection, so that this type of disconnect does not happen. This type of, because there is a disconnect now. Disconnect is on account of this document. Of course, on account of existing practice as well. So I think just a small chapter on need for long-term transmission planning, which is one of the objectives also of this document, so that it happens properly and so that every stakeholder is obliged. Because the doubt here is failure of STU. STU has started not functioning in the manner CTU has started. And of course, even center we have been delayed. There is no. So similarly, they should start functioning a little different from state transmission licensee. Licensee is different. Licensees are companies. STU is not company. So this demarcation should happen. And STU and CTU put together, along with, of course, CEA and all others who are there. They should be doing a futuristic demand projection, which they can go on correcting, as you rightly said. Maybe every 2-3 years they can go on correcting, so that damage is not done. Okay, any other point?
इसमें जो है सर, जो अभी आएगा ना, जो jurisdiction issue आएगी आपकी, that is CERC.
Okay.
CTU,
We will make a recommendation on having
so
some idea, giving some.
My suggestion to this is, sir, जो in fact पहले भी था, जो CA के हाथ में
तुम फोन करके देखो ना कहाँ है, पता लगा वो
Any other suggestion? No, any other suggestion on limitations, because we are trying to pinpoint certain things which are needed, because most of the things are very well done. So Sardana made some point on limitations. One point you made, let me understand from you, Anil. You said that high BG for generating companies, something like that you said. What do you mean by high BG for generating companies?
There are provisions for bank guarantees to be taken when you apply for GNA. And there are methods, BG1, BG2, BG3. There are 3 aspects that are provided in the document in terms of how they get encashed in the event that you're not complying to those requirements. The amounts that are indicated, according to me, are quite steep. While the
how much for 1,000 megawatt? How much it is?
So there is a formulation given exactly. I won't be able to.
No, I was working out for 1,000 megawatt is 10 crore or something like that.
Yeah. So no. So I will separately give you those details.
Okay.
Yeah.
Because
so that was the point.
That is one specific point you have made in the limitation of this. So therefore, we need to be clear. Because I was not very sure whether that amount is very high. Because I mean, if they just put connectivity, do the connectivity, and rest of the things follow, and generator after all vanishes, then what happens? Then naturally there has to be some obligation on their part.
That is true. That is true.
But so you have to see really, is it too high or what? That is one point you made. Srikant, are you there? You made a need for the national level planning. And how do you foresee that is happening? Part of that thing, I think Ghanshyam has clearly demonstrated, but how much of it needs to be at least mentioned in this document?
Sir, I don't think this document can address those issues. I don't think so. But it is something which needs to be done after deliberation as a part of the planning regulations or planning process of CEA and so on. I don't think the GNA cannot be stretched to cover all these things.
No, GNA will not be stretched to cover all this, but GNA otherwise has created some disconnect between.
No, it's not a disconnect, I would say, sir, but it will require national level planning for the full benefit of this to come. Let me put it this way. It's not a disconnect.
Let me add to what Shrikant is saying. The basic premise of GNA is that eventually we service the customer better, because the demand side planning is to be done. We will do all the planning of transmission system. based on bottoms up aggregation of the load. Now, CTU is providing a framework at the national level, but eventually the electrons have to flow to the ultimate beneficiary, the demand. So what I think Shrikant and we all meant was the fact that for a long time we are seeing that we are only seeing ISTS system or the CTU system in isolation. Eventually the state system can be optimized or perhaps designed more prudently. If there was a planning, he said 132 kV, I would say wherever, whatever is the threshold for sub-transmission system. If in a state, the sub-transmission system is at 33 kV, everything above that should be at one planning level. So that when we do the aggregation of load at state level wise, we should provide N-1 criteria or N-1 criteria. All those criteria at state level today are dysfunctional. And I'm making a bit loaded statement, but that's the way it is. Today, other than CTU, nobody really worries about N-1, N-1, nobody cares about that.
No, we are, Anil, we are only trying to focus. All those things we know. Does this document have a responsibility to say something, or it doesn't have the responsibility? That is the point. No? Rest of the discussion, we will have transmission planning discussion and etc. etc.
So there is a separate CERC transmission regulation. That has to be brought in line with this. And times CA's transmission planning code will have also be brought in line with this.
So like Rakesh has answered, if there is a transmission planning regulation or transmission system planning regulation, does it cover STU? It doesn't cover STU. That is, see, only 2 points are emerging. Since discoms are coming in the picture for making the payment and generators are giving the BG for connectivity. Discoms are making the payment. Discoms get the power only when STU also is active to ensure that it happens. And there are examples and examples galore. The question is, this document will not cover everything, but this document has to make reference to, if it is transmission planning regulation, this planning regulation, it has to make, because this will succeed only when that happens, otherwise gaps will get created. That's the only point we were discussing. And limitation on, Sardana mentioned of some of the limitations, we will take them only when they are really very heavy things. Like he said, there is a fine. Then another thing he said, very heavy fine for refranchising or something like that, that relinquishing. Then Rakesh, you answered that question, that point is not for the existing ones, for the future one. Why should it be there? I mean, if they are booking and if they get away, cancellation has a charge. No? Cancellation has a charge. So if you have serial limitation, Anil, then you can make that when we will scrutinize that your limitations that you are pointing out are okay. Then we can make recommendation. Otherwise, not.
No, sure.
Anything else? Okay, then we close. We are already 1 o'clock, almost 1 o'clock.
Okay.
Vote of thanks by Mr. Baga.
Thank you, Mr. Sai. Now, since Mr. Banga could not join, who is the convener of this group in India Energy Forum, I will request Mr. Sardana, chairman of the group, to propose the vote of thanks.
Yeah.
But we had very fruitful discussions on the GNA likely to come up, which will solve to some extent the present problems. Floor is yours, Mr. Sardana, please.
Thank you, Mr. Bambani. Let me start from you itself. So thanks to you and your entire efficient staff that we had a seamless conduct of the proceedings for today, and organizing this workshop was much easier. I would like to thank profusely, rather, Mr. Shahi already did that, Chairperson CRC, who incidentally is not there on the call anymore, but tremendous thanks to him for having joined. Thanks to all the speakers who, despite their travel, etc., made sure that their colleagues would join, or both Sanjay made sure Devanand would join, as also Narsimhan made sure that Mr. Varpanda was available to us. So thank you to both of them. Thank you to Shrikant, who, despite his travel accommodated us and spared this time. And thank you to Mr. Bhaskar, as also to Mr. Ghanshyam Prasad. Both have been always very, very forthcoming in terms of such deliberations. So personal thanks to both of them for accommodating this. And thanks to all the participants, especially for your views and your encouragement at all times. So once again, and I would not miss out on the fact that the president of IEF, who personally pushed us to bring this topic at this stage, and for his guidance to have given the details in terms of context setting, and of course for organizing the chief guest himself, because he was in doubts, stating to me that I don't want to be in the two events within a gap of 15 days. So thank you to Mr. Shahi and to everyone else also. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Mr. Sandana. We have come to the close of this very fruitful flagship webinar. I invite you, we will have next webinar on role of regulators in decarbonizing the power sector on May 14. Mr. Rakesh Nath is organizing this webinar. So you will get the invitation, but I'm just mentioning. So thank you very much and have a nice lunch. Unfortunately, we are not able to offer you lunch because this is on virtual mode. But hopefully,
e-lunch.
So hopefully in future we will have the physical webinars where we can have together lunch. Thank you very much.